Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Stephanie Kirk, and I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities here at Washington University in St. Louis, and I'd like to welcome you to our annual faculty book celebration in the Center for the Humanities. This is our most important event of the year, and I'm really glad to see everyone and that you did not go to all the other events that were annoyingly scheduled at the same time. We, in this event, showcase the books published by our amazing faculty in the humanities and in other disciplines beyond the humanities, but our focus is really the humanities and the research we do as humanities scholars. With the research collected in these books, which you have been able to take a look at, WashU Humanities faculty are revitalizing and reinforcing the purpose of the humanities. And the questions in the books displayed here today, and in our virtual exhibition, which I suggest you visit because it's pretty cool, and that allows me now to welcome all the people who are checking in online. In our exhibitions, both here and virtually, you will find our scholars asking questions about a wide range of issues that pertain to culture, art, politics, and the daily lives of human beings, both today and throughout history. Publishing a book of research in humanities and beyond or creative practice is not an easy feat. But many of the books here were published during the pandemic, which made publicizing and speaking about them challenging and even lonelier, perhaps, than humanistic scholarship can be. That is why this event is so important, and I hope you will stay and celebrate with us afterwards. We've got 3 speakers today, 2 of our own faculty, who will briefly discuss their recently published books, and then we'll hear from our invited speaker. But before I introduce our invited speaker and before we hear from our wonderful colleagues, I'd like to ask Julie Singer, Professor of French and Chair of Romance Languages, to introduce our first presenter.
Hi, everyone. It's a great honor to celebrate our colleague, Dr. Miguel Valerio. Professor Valerio is an interdisciplinary literary and cultural scholar of the African diaspora in colonial Latin America, with a particular focus on Catholic and festive practices of Afro-Latin Americans in Mexico and Brazil. His innovative scholarship has already captured the attention of a wide and varied audience, from the Ford Foundation to the chefs at Rick Bayless's Frontera Grill in Chicago. Professor Valerio has been recognized with awards for both his teaching and his research, and if there were an award for collegiality, he would surely deserve that too. Dr. Valerio has authored numerous articles interpreting the textual, performance, and visual culture of Afro-descendant confraternities and communities, including Architects of Their Own Humanity, Race, Devotion, and Artistic Agency in Afro-Brazilian Confraternal Churches in 18th Century Salvador and Ouro Preto, which appeared in the journal Colonial Latin American Review and was awarded the Afro-Latin American Afro-Latinx Scholarship Prize by the Association for Latin American Art and the Visual Culture section of the Latin American Studies Association. He has co-edited 2 volumes, Indigenous and Black Confraternities in Colonial Latin America with Javier Jaque Hidalgo, and Constructing the Racial Other in Latin America, Race and Ethnicity from Colonial Times to the Present with Mabel Moraña. His second monograph, if I'm getting ahead of myself, so does he, but in a good way. His second monograph is titled Architects of Their World, the Artistic and Ritualistic Spaces of Afro-Brazilian Brotherhoods, and is already under contract with Cambridge University Press. But first, let's take a step back and celebrate his first monograph, which not only shines by all traditional academic standards, but has the additional distinction of having sold out in pre-orders on Amazon.com. I refer, of course, to Sovereign Joy, Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens, 1539 to 1640, published by Cambridge in 2022. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Valerio to the podium.
Thank you, Julie, for that kind introduction. And I'm honored to be included in this celebration. I won't thank everyone who made this book possible. You can read the acknowledgments, which go on forever. But I must thank my wife, who is here, for her patience and support throughout all my academic endeavors. In March 2013, I came across a passage that described a procession of more than 50 black adults and children, all on horseback, led by their king and queen. This passage naturally intrigued me, as I had never encountered anything like it in more than 5 years studying Latin American literature and culture. The passage describes a black performance that took place in Mexico City in 1539. Am I stepping on the... The performance took place within a larger two-day festival. I would dedicate the next 7 years of my life to studying this tradition among Afro-Mexicans. In those years, I discovered that this performance and others I found in Mexico City belong to a widespread black tradition, and that Afro-descendants preferred this festive form of expression above all others throughout the diaspora. And I found examples after example. It is, if we're going to perform as a sovereign people. In the book that resulted from my research, Sovereign Joy, Afro-Mexican Kings and Queens, 1539-1640, I studied these traditions among Afro-Mexicans as an expression of black sovereignty, joy, and being, of collective social, cultural, and political agency and selfhood. In the 1980s, the Jamaican scholar Orlando Patterson argued that slavery necessarily implied the social death of the enslaved. In other words, the death of their souls, their being human. Scholars responded right away with examples that show that Afro-descendants did not let slavery kill their souls, their being. Instead, they found ways, even in the worst circumstances, like in the US South or a Brazilian plantation, to express themselves and form culture, the culture that has given us a huge portion of hemispheric American culture, from New England to Buenos Aires, especially music and cuisine. Let's not be limiting. The performative tradition I study in Sovereign Joy, which has been documented from New England to Buenos Aires, is a powerful, nay, sovereign example of this defiant joy, to borrow a phrase from the US Black writer Imani Perry. Through this performative tradition, Afro-descendants express both symbolically and politically their cultural and communal sovereignty, joyfully, defiantly affirming their being and their humanity. In studying this Black tradition, Sovereign Joy invites us to think about Black sovereignty, joy, and being as realities within the realm of possibility for our ancestors, not the macro sovereignty that the Cameroonian philosopher Kili Membe has denounced as violent, but the micro sovereignty Afro-descendants achieve and continue to rot through community, and we know this all too well. Through community, joy, and defiance, which forms our humanity in a world where our lives don't matter. And I was finishing the book, and the final title came to me in the summer of 2020, and Imani Perry had written about how we don't need to look at the Black experience only through the suffering that's been inflicted upon the people of African descent for 400 years, but also the joy that we have sought to rot through community, which is a defiant joy. As I say in the preface to Sovereign Joy, to study joy is not to forget pain. Afro-Mexicans were routinely attacked for their festive practices, to the point that in 1612, 35 Afro-Mexicans were hanged, quartered, and their heads put on display. But this did not stop Afro-Mexicans from continuing this tradition, just as the West's anti-Black hegemony has not stopped Black people from seeking joy. As another Black U.S. scholar has put it, Tracy Michael Lewis Giggets, and if you haven't read her book, Black Joy, or listened to it, I'm listening to it on audiobook, our joy and our trauma both sit on a continuum. It doesn't have to be binary. By studying the Black experience from this perspective, Sovereign Joy seeks to restore dignity to our forebears in the struggle for ultimate freedom. Mexico is hardly thought of as an important site of Black culture, especially during early modernity. But the texts I analyze in Sovereign Joy demonstrate that our picture of the African diaspora is incomplete without considering the vicissitudes and cultural lives in 16th and 17th century Mexico, a place you wouldn't think. And also, we need to look to other parts of the hemisphere to understand the Black experience. To see how I go about this analysis, I encourage you to read Sovereign Joy and to build militant community of joy. And because my book is very visual, it has 40 images, so if you like book with images, it has 40 images. I'll show you. Well, there's a cover, some of the images, and the cover is inspired by this performance, which I found in Mexico City in 1610, but I found it throughout the African diaspora, right, this performance. It begins as a European performance, but what happens in Mexico City in 1610 is that a Black group reappropriates it and makes it their own, right, and redefines it and gives it new meaning. And of course, and also one of the things that I came to believe and absolutely believe is that this performance also went to inspire how allegories of Africa would be presented. And this is the performance in Brazil, where it's still done. And so the cover is the only image in the book by a Black artist. And this is allegory of Africa, but it has deep connection to that performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Miguel. Now I'd like to ask Professor Matthias Goretz, who is teaching professor in the program of comparative literature, to come and introduce our next faculty speaker.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our second faculty speaker today, Hortense and Tobias Levin, distinguished professor in the humanities, Dr. Lynne Tatlock, who is going to talk about the transmission, diffusion, and literary survival, or afterlife, of Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre in the German-speaking territories. How did this English novel become so significant in the German-speaking landscape in the time span from the March Revolution 1848 to the end of the First World War in 1918? Multiple translations and countless adaptations of one work signify a struggle over meaning and promise of literature. But what made Jane Eyre such a popular and contested character? How did translating, reading, and staging the book create new ideas of women's freedom and equality? Lynne Tatlock grew up in the Midwest, in the heart of the country, as William Gass put it, first moving around due to her parents' teaching jobs, then settling in West Lafayette, Indiana. But books and libraries, the potency of literature for transformation, has been everything to her. No wonder then that The Wizard of Oz and its magical journey of a young girl is one of Professor Tatlock's favorite movies of all time. A revered teacher, scholar, and translator of literature, Lynne Tatlock has spent almost her entire career advising people not only on their degrees and PhDs, but on their stance on literature. Why do we read? What does reading bring to us? Professor Tatlock has published widely on German literature and culture of vast periods from the 1650s to the 1990s. She's been serving as chair in Germanic languages and literatures and director of comparative literature. It was primarily her vision and initiative to create the International Writers Track, a unique PhD program which brought some of the most exciting emerging writers worldwide to this campus. But we are not in Kansas anymore, nor in Indiana. Today we are in St. Louis and delve into the realm of Jane Eyre in German lands. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Lynne Tatlock.
Thank you, Matthias. So how many of you have read Jane Eyre in English or in translation? How many of you were under 15 when you read it for the first time? What is it that you remember most about this novel or the experience of reading it? I myself read Jane Eyre at 12 or 13 for the first time. I read it a second time when I was in my 30s, and a third time in my late 50s, when I turned to a historical body of material that became the impetus and basis for the book Jane Eyre in German Lands. As is not terribly surprising, the novel was the same and yet not the same upon each subsequent reading. Each time it fascinated me. In the first reading, as a titillating horror story about things I did not yet understand. At the second time, as the self-presentation of a very angry woman. And the third, as a sensitive depiction of a brainy heroine who longed for conversation and recognition and got it. A lot had happened to me between these readings, and it's no surprise that each time different features of this heterogeneous text stood out. The same truth proved true for Charita's Bischof, one of my German-speaking historical readers who did not even know how to pronounce the heroine's last name. She pronounced it Eyre, which means eggs in German, and unfortunately, also testicles. 19th century German language satirists had nasty fun with this play on words. In fact, Bischof had read wildly different versions of the novel in German. In the 1850s of her childhood and adolescence, the work had already begun to mutate and proliferate in the German book market. The first Jane Eyre she read, an adaptation, the pious heroine, German Johanna, never even encounters the alluring Rochester, but instead marries a minister. A St. John's stand-in. The first reading inspired Bischof to emulate Jane's governess apparel and to try her hand at writing. Her father punished her severely for wasting time. In her second Jane Eyre, one of 3 then extant translations, Bischof found her budding adolescent sexual self and was led to imagine a pathway out of her personal misery. Sometime thereafter, she made a vain break for freedom. Later, she became a governess. Both readings inspired Bischof to write and to tell stories, including a story of herself, one that features accounts of her early reading. Variations of such readings, mine, Bischoff's, and many others, figure in my book. They are inspired by the multifarious forms in which Jane Eyre circulated in the German-speaking world, in multiple translations, in adaptations, including adaptations for girls, on the stage, in satires, and in the 10 novels and 3 novellas of the transatlantic best-selling German novelist Eugenie Marlitt. Through Marlitt's plots, all of which circulated in many languages and also in multiple English translations, Jane Eyre's romance revived in exhilarating, popular, lightly updated, and pleasantly foreign forms. Shorter novels that reliably reproduced for the serial reader something akin to Jane Eyre's romance dynamics, with happy endings in which the heroine achieves a form of parody and recognition. In the book, I demonstrate the ways in which this novel mattered to certain readers in the period 1848 to 1918. The 70 years between the so-called European March revolutions, in which the educated middle classes unsuccessfully asserted their rights vis-a-vis the old autocratic, aristocratic system, and the end of the First World War, when after a disastrous defeat and the collapse of a militaristic empire, German women were enfranchised for the first time. Even in some adapted forms, the novel, as I show, could model for readers in this period, and not just for women and girls, new forms of intimacy, and social and intellectual possibility. I had several clues to such historical reading from the very start of the project, clues originating not in Germany, but rather in information about the American market and American library transactions. With help from Douglas Knox and Stephen Pentecost of our Humanities Digital Workshop, I probed a database of American library transactions from 1890s Muncie, Indiana, and found, for example, that the same demographic with regard to age and gender that borrowed Marlitt's novels in English also borrowed Jane Eyre. The overlap prompted my first comparisons of these novels to Jane Eyre in search of clues concerning the historical appeal of Bronte's novels to German language readers. In our own times, feminist and post-colonial readings have resisted, even ridiculed, many of the romance mechanisms that I see as empowering and inspiring. These rereadings interest me quite a bit, but they are not the story that I tell in this book. My book shows that contemporaries were well aware of the unsettling and liberating force of the novel. Adaptations, especially those for girls, make this clear through their omissions and revisions. Jane becomes less angry, less sad, less morally adventurous, more pious, ingratiating, and forgiving. Bertha Mason becomes less violent, less frightening, more piteously wretched. Rochester becomes less morally ambiguous, less angry, his language less harsh and masculine in these toned down and effectively censored versions. Literate girls, however, luckily, had recourse to translations and were not necessarily tethered to these anodyne adaptations. If these revisions are not indication enough that elements of the unadulterated Jane Eyre were opening up new vistas for their readers, one novel for girls, whose lesson is that the heroine needs to work on her penmanship rather than write melancholy poetry, opens with the heroine sighing over Rochester and then hiding her book from her mother. By the end of the novel, Jane Eyre has completely disappeared, and romance in that vein has been set aside. Penmanship and regressive play with dolls instead win the day. Meanwhile, as adaptations of Jane Eyre for late century girls blocked the pleasures of romance, they instead encouraged readers to relish the stages of Jane's suffering as an orphan, that is, as Die Waise von Lowood, the orphan of Lowood. The unwarranted suffering of children, it seems, was age appropriate. While multiple translations and adaptations of Jane Eyre in the end provide my most compelling evidence for the appeal of this novel, their sheer number initially proved to be a challenge. For one thing, I couldn't reliably determine which translations or even which adaptations individual historical readers borrowed and bought. And the detail of thousands of pages of text was quite simply overwhelming. Trained in close reading, favoring deep archaeological dives into text rather than surface reading, one instinctually obsesses over every single variation to provide in each instance explanation and judgment. While I do undertake close textual analysis, compare translations, and evaluate discursive formations in this project, the methods of distant reading also prompted me to look at the books as an aggregate. This was key. As the cultural theorist Olivier Morin has observed, more important for the perpetuation of traditions than accuracy of transmission is quantity. Repetition, redundancy, and proliferation, because they increase quantity, better serve transmission. Transfer, that is, occurs more effectively in swarms than sequential proliferation of a single item. And indeed, Jane Eyre traveled in a swarm. It remained a recognizable cultural referent throughout the period in both great and minuscule variation. It did not even have to be explicitly named to be recognized. In many cases, however, 19th century Germans and Austrians first encountered the highly adapted play, Die Waise von Lowood, The Orphan of Lowood, without knowing the novel at all. And yet contemporaries nevertheless gained thereby a rough idea of the power of the original. Morin notes a corollary to the central force of quantity necessary to the endurance of tradition, namely intrinsic appeal. identifying the intrinsic appeal of Jane Eyre for the historical period, what Bronte's contemporary, the novelist Mrs. Oliphant, begrudgingly labeled a new kind of romance, ultimately stands at the heart of my book. Romance, with its happy endings, has notoriously invited condescension. The Guggenheim Foundation, as but one example, eschews romance writing, among other popular forms, as not within our scope. Yet scholars of romance writing have long recognized not only the power of romance structures, but also the protean nature of romance. This protean nature allows it to adapt to needs and tastes of particular times and places. For the 19th century German language reader, the mutual recognition and respect that underpins a conversation all day long that promises never to flag held special appeal. And that particular dynamic is reproduced serially in Marlot's novels, too, in imitation of Jane Eyre. A 19th century German reviewer termed governesses the Proletariat des Geistes, the proletariat of the intellect. And if that was so, then the character Jane Eyre, the quintessential representative of this well-educated, powerless, impoverished, and obscure group, found her way to equality, meaning, acknowledgement, and status, thereby speaking to the hopes of an entire class of readers. To imagine a happy ending in romance reading, therefore, does not have to be seen as cruel optimism, as famously formulated by Lauren Berlant, visions of a good life that can never be, but instead as the spur to become an active subject. In German lands, proliferating Jane Eyre had something of that animating effect. In closing, I point to a particular historical reader, one who imbibed and adapted the potential for action inherent in the romance dynamic. Narrating her early years as a reader, the anarchist Emma Goldman testifies to girls' need for both enjoyment and something more than the bitter claims of real life. Romance reading, as Goldman's autobiography suggests, could positively inform the habits of being of girls and the women they would become. Goldman read Marlot together with her female German teacher around 1880 in Königsberg. While young Emma and her teacher bonded over Marlot's heroines, more than sympathy emerged from their romance reading. Indeed, her teacher encouraged her to continue her education in Germany, fueling dreams of studying medicine and thus suggesting another kind of felicity. Emma's real world, however, proved harsh. As she tells it in a Jane Eyre-like scenario, her male religion teacher shamed her before her entire class, declaring that she was a horrible child and would grow into a worse woman. Like Jane, Goldman persisted. This recollection of reading Marlot in particular and dashed girlhood dreams occurs in the same chapter in which Goldman affirms sexual passion and rewrites the romance narrative to embrace her political activism. Here she recounts both her love for Ed Brady, in whose arms she learned the meaning of the great life-giving force, and her need to give precedence to her political mission, her true love. The terms in which she writes herself as a notorious, passionate, and committed political player belong unmistakably to a romantic narrative prototype, even when the romantic object is politics and not a person. Many thanks to the Center for the Humanities for inviting me to speak at this year's book collection, and thanks to all of you for your attention. Congratulations to all my colleagues recognized on this occasion. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our wonderful faculty presenters. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Davarian L. Baldwin, who is the Paul E. Rather Distinguished Professor of American Studies at Trinity College, and worthy of note, has his PhD from NYU. I think we were there at the same time, but we did not know each other. And the NYU piece is very important if you've read Davarian's book. His work largely examines the landscape of global cities, through the lens of the African diasporic experience. His work, I skipped a line. He's a leading urbanist, historian, and cultural critic. His related interests include universities and urban development, the racial foundations of academic thought, intellectual and mass culture, Black radical thought, and transnational social movements, the politics of heritage tourism, and 20th and 21st century art, architecture, and urban design. He's the author of Chicago's New Negroes, Modernity, the Great Migration, and Black Urban Life from 2007, and co-editor with Minka Makalani of the essay collection Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem, published in 2013. He's currently finishing Land of Darkness, Chicago and the Making of Race in Modern America, which will be coming out with Oxford University Press. He, as those of you who attended our panel earlier today on Humanities in the City, you will know that he is also the creator of a stunning jigsaw puzzle about the Harlem Renaissance. And in addition to his many other accomplishments, he is the founding director of the Smart Cities Lab at Trinity College. Today, Davarian Baldwin is going to talk to us about his latest book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities, a book that everyone who lives in a city or is interested in cities, both inside and outside of academia, should absolutely read. In this book, he unpacks the problematic relationship between residents and urban universities grounded in several case studies, including, as I mentioned earlier, NYU. But he also offers a path forward, which has additional and specific resonance for those of us who work at WashU right now as we go through our strategic planning process. This book has been sitting on my desk for the last 6 months or so, and everyone, and I am not exaggerating, who has been to my office has picked it up and said, "Oh my God, I love this book," or "I've heard so much about this book," or "Can I take a picture of the cover so I can get it?" So we are so lucky to have him here to talk about it today. Before I let him speak, I must thank the amazing center staff for the incredible work that went in putting this together, to Alicia Dean, to Kathleen Fields, who cannot be here with us today because she's snowed in Minneapolis, Ignacio Infante, and Wendy Anderson. I must give a special shout out to Laura Perry, our Assistant Director for Research and Community Engagement, who does her job so very well and put this book in my hands and said, "You have got to read this." And I do not believe that I am the only one she did this to, so I think Davarian, she is someone you can hire to do publicity for you. So thank you, Laura, for initiating the process that brought Professor Baldwin here today. And without further ado, please welcome him as he talks about what good is higher education for our cities.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that warm and humbling introduction. I appreciate you and for taking your leadership over this center. I also want to thank Alicia and Laura for their stewardship and making it possible for me to be here and being such welcoming hosts in this process. I also want to say it's really important to be here. I mean, I've lived on the East Coast for 30 years, but I was born and raised in Wisconsin. Yes, there are Black people in Wisconsin. And it's something about being here that even when you're on the East Coast, all of this is like a no place until you get to LA. So it means something to be back in the Midwest, to be home. There's something resonant about being here, even though growing up I didn't consider St. Louis to be my home or a part of my home, but being here now in this context, it's important, it's exciting, it's important to be home. So thank you all for that. I also want to congratulate Miguel and Lynne for their amazing work and all of the faculty scholars whose books are on display here. So please just give them a round of applause again, please. So the title of my talk or my remarks for this afternoon, evening, wherever we are in this point of the day, but I'll just say good evening to everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Yes. Good Midwestern boy. That's how you talk, right? So the title of my remarks are, what good is higher education for our cities? In May of 2022, I received a phone call from a University City, Missouri, and it was City Council person Jeff Hales. And he told me that his city was facing a serious problem and thought that I could help. Councilperson Hales had read an article I'd written in a public magazine about the growing impact of colleges and universities on their host cities. For him, my thoughts really hit close to home. He told me that the affluent community of Clayton to the near south has about 40 acres of Washington University's campus. And over the past 30 years, Clayton has begun to limit the expansion of WashU dormitories. In turn, WashU has turned here, has started buying up scores of multifamily residential properties in the more modest community of University City. The university touts its economic impact on the city. But he told me that this university expansion has actually brought an unexpected adverse effect on his community. Number one, these purchases of these homes by the university takes the properties off the tax rolls, which diminishes the city budget for public services like schools and infrastructure. Number two, because WashU rents by the bed, so basically it's carving up these single-family homes into what we call mini individual units. This has encouraged other landlords to follow suit, which has driven up the market rate in housing all across the city, which makes what were once working-class neighborhoods no longer affordable for single families. I told him that not only does this process have a name, it's called studentification, but also these impacts that this town is facing from university-driven urban development are part of a much larger story. Right before our eyes, colleges and universities have become the biggest employers, real estate holders, healthcare providers, and even policing agents in major cities and college towns all across the country. With this kind of influence comes the possibility that universities make cities and towns more vibrant places to work, visit, learn, and live. From New York City's Cornell Tech on Roosevelt Island to Mesa, Arizona's recent Arizona State University satellite campus, everyone wants to buy and build a campus. And to be sure, colleges and universities bring ideas and people together, and they generate jobs and this word will become important in a minute, new innovations. We've heard that before, right? Yes? No? Yes. Okay. Stay with me. Okay? University developments often involve transformative commercial developments like the Innovation Corridor in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, USC Village in what's now called South LA. We call it South Central back in the day. The cleaned up version, right? The University of Cincinnati's Innovation Corridor. The Biomedical Campus Innovation Center in Phoenix. West Philadelphia's U City Square. Miami Converge in South Florida. And of course, WashU's own Cortex, say it with me, Innovation Community. We can also expect newly constructed facilities like the glittering glass and steel that we see in the proposed partnership between Virginia Tech and Amazon in Northern Virginia. It should also be noted that 6 of the 7 corridors shown before you were all developed by the same Wexford Science and Technology company that built out Cortex. So the point here is that these innovation districts are big business. Some companies only specialize in university-cited and sponsored urban development projects. More on that later. The point here is that in these projects, we have seen higher education's growing control over the economic development and political governance in urban America, or what I call the rise of universities. Higher education has become big business. In our cities, they're company towns. But there is a cost for those living in the shadows of these ivory towers. How so? Campus expansions can raise housing costs and displaced residents in the neighborhoods largely of color that surround campuses. Higher education's broad control over labor can lower wage ceilings and suppress collective bargaining efforts. Nonprofit university medical centers emphasize profitable boutique services, high-profile research, or prioritize student services to the detriment of indigent care, which is a precondition for their tax exemption. Campus police forces surveil and profile the same residents and are rarely held to public account. Even if schools don't hold all of this power, we are witnessing greater swaths of our cities being turned into a campus. So how did we get here? How did the city, our cities, become campuses? Well, first of all, in the 1950s and 60s, we witnessed a period of what's been called white flight, which is actually a misnomer because it wasn't like white people just fled the city. It was that capital and power fled the city, and white people were the only ones allowed to follow. So let's be clear about that. White flight is cute, it's alliterative, but it's not actually accurate in terms of how things work. But the point is that when white Americans were allowed to follow power and capital, universities were too big to move. They tried. Let's be clear. Almost any university you might have heard of tried to leave the city, but were not nimble enough. So in response, universities in the cities bunkered themselves down behind institutional walls or state-funded demolitions of growing black and brown communities that were coming around these communities because of the Bracero program, because of the second wave of the Great Migration. So this becomes the new urban dynamic in the 50s and 60s. And so universities couldn't move, so they turned themselves into these balkanized fortresses. And they renamed themselves, they rebranded. You'll know this phrase. They began to call themselves anchor institutions, right? So turning a liability into an asset. The point here is to make their balkanization less inhumane. Also, city boosters began to see these institutions as the potential economic investors or engines as capital and white labor fled cities. But by the 1990s, the children, or might be more accurate, the grandchildren of suburban sprawl began looking back to the city. They got tired of 7-Elevens and miles of tract housing. They wanted an urban experience. Either they would go to college and stay, or young professionals and even empty nesters, retirees, began what was called in the 90s the Back to the City movement. I lived in New York City in the 1990s when Rudolph Giuliani, right, was instituting the quality of life campaigns, kicking out houseless people from ATM vestibules, arresting them for taking up more than one seat on a train, making way for this Back to the City movement, turning mental health institutions into high-end luxury housing. I was a part of that process in graduate school at NYU, right? So you begin to see this convergence, this role where you have also cities and private investors underwriting tech startups, design companies when the web was just coming online around 93, 95, converting factories and warehouses into loft housing, into open space workspaces, right? All this is happening in the 90s. I'm giving this backdrop for a reason, because in this period, you have cities competing with each other to capture the revenue streams that would come with empty nesters and young professionals coming back into these redesigned cities. At the same time, universities were trying to compensate for shrinking state contributions to their budgets. And let's be clear, whether you are the University of Missouri, or Washington University St. Louis, you get federal money, whether through direct infusion of federal grants or through federal loans from students. So this contribution from the state was shrinking. So in this moment, again, you have cities competing for young professionals and empty nesters. You have universities looking for new revenue streams. In this moment, you have a period of what I call interest convergence between these two entities. University leaders and city officials have this interest convergence where they begin to think about the university as an urban form, as a model for making cities more attractive to these returnees, while also creating revenue streams for university budgets. In short, the Ivory Tower was reconceptualized as the new smokestacks of the city, the economic power of the city. And in the face of this, we begin to see new language coming up, this notion of knowledge communities. Because in this context, higher education became the new face of not just higher education, but capitalism, in what we call the late stage of capitalism. What do I mean by that? In this period, we see the rise of the conversation about the knowledge economy. What does this mean? Academic research is being used to create profitable commercial goods or patents in a range of fields, from pharmaceutical industries and software products to health services and military defense weaponry. Humanities folks, you wonder where all your budgets are going to? At WashU? That's where it's going, right? Cortex, pharmaceutical companies, the Grove. Yes, I know about the Grove. Right? There's a shift in the money's not going away. We say austerity. It doesn't mean the money went away. It just means it got redirected in these profit-oriented orientations. So the piece that I'm adding to the conversation is that in trying to build out these knowledge economies in these previously divested and depressed and sometimes dangerous urban communities, key to recruiting the best students, faculty, and their families, that's an important part, and their families, to do this knowledge work is by creating an urbane cluster of laboratories, housing, retail, and nightlife. These variously called innovation districts or knowledge communities, yes, Wexford, come back again, St. Louis's own Wexford, right? Sit right in the middle of existing communities of color. North St. Louis, right? Surrounding campuses, where for them the land is relatively cheap, but also the political power of these communities is most vulnerable. So in this context, the campus as an urban form has become a planning mechanism to build out universities by extracting neighborhood blocks to maximize wealth extraction based on land control, labor management, and the privatization of governance. On the left, you have Pittsburgh. This is Bakery Square, in partnership between Carnegie Mellon, Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, and you see the top on that tower? Who was that? Google. Right. On the right, you have Harper Court, what they've designed, and you hear this phrase all day long, live, work, play space. Partnership between private investors, the city of Chicago, and the University of Chicago, right in the middle of the South Side in Hyde Park. This is what we mean by knowledge communities. Live, work, play. Investors, campus workers, lab workers, and their families, creating a full urbane experience right in the middle of existing communities of color to do that knowledge economy work. And so this formation plays out again in at least three key areas: land, labor, and governance. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, with this new design, what makes higher education actually good for the public? Number one, land. Universities and colleges, let's be clear, the biggest land holders in their cities. Not insurance, not Ford, not Amazon, universities. What good? What's the good? What's the good? Off the top, we presume that schools are inherent public goods, most clearly marked by their 501c3 status as nonprofits, which gives them tax exemption on their property. But this nonprofit designation is precisely what allows for an easier transfer of public dollars into higher education's private developments with little public scrutiny. The status, the tax status of being of educational purposes on the land becomes a valuable tax shelter. I said this earlier. We talk a lot about the corporatization of higher education. The presumption that the idea that higher education was pure and in its pursuits and then gets corrupted by corporate interests. The land piece makes it clear, no, it's more complicated than that. What's actually happening is that the nonprofit status of higher education gives it a unique pathway to profit extraction. It's not about being like a company. It's about taking advantage of the exemptions and the advantages of being higher education. Does that make sense? That's the rub. In late capitalism, nonprofit status has been manipulated or understood as a vantage point for different kinds of wealth extraction that corporations can't do. This is why now private corporations are putting their labs, their workers, where? Where? On campuses. On campuses. Look around. Look around. You see it? It's all around you. So these schools pay virtually no taxes on their increasingly prominent urban footprint, up and down Del Mar. Yet they reap the benefits of the municipal services. Like what? Fire, police, road maintenance, public schools. And while at the same time, residential property taxes of longtime residents on fixed incomes and rental property costs rise and public facilities remain underfunded. So you're like, wait a minute, my property tax is going up, but there's no improvements because I'm next to a university. Right? In 2016, this is the backdrop picture is of the neighborhood Witherspoon Jackson. In 2016, this neighborhood residents, they won an $18 million lawsuit against Princeton University. They realized that they were standing or sitting next to Princeton University buildings where their property taxes were going up. There were no improvements. And what was going on those Princeton campuses? They had this multi-million-dollar partnership with Eli Lilly. Eli Lilly was using Princeton buildings as a tax shelter, which was then the costs were being passed on to the historically black neighborhood of Witherspoon Jackson. When one resident found out what he considered to be corruption, it's legal, but the work that was going on here with this partnership between this pharmaceutical company and this university, he dismissed Princeton University as a hedge fund that conducts classes. Right? In Arizona, where real estate is king, I spent years out there, the wild, wild west. Arizona State University President Michael Crow realized that not only do we have tax exemptions for educational purposes, but we can do whatever we want with our real estate. So we are going to host the biggest private development in the state of Arizona, which is a State Farm insurance building on Arizona State University campus. And then we're going to charge them a slightly lower fee than they would pay in taxes, because they're tax exempt, because they're on our land. We're going to charge them a slightly lower fee, and then use that to build football stadiums and hire an ex-NFL coach, Herm Edwards, who got fired recently, and build up our programs in ways that can bypass the oversight of state legislators. That's the game. That's the hustle. In the hood, we call this space age pimping, right? Running big game. This is gangster. That's gangster. Right? So, finally, we know that in 2021, as I said before, Washington University converting single-family homes into mini dorms, taking them off the rolls, rising values above the means of long-standing residents in the university city, because Clayton, the more powerful community, said no more. That's the land piece. Universities are also the largest employers in their cities. What's the good? We talk a lot about workers in the knowledge community, knowledge factories, as being primarily faculty. But even if we take faculty for a minute, today, non-tenure track positions of all types account for how much of the faculty here in the country? You know? 75%. 75%. So even we want to kind of caricature the tweed-jacketed, leather-elbowed, cigar-smoking faculty. Oh, I'm sorry. Even we want to caricature that motif, the bourbon-sipping faculty, that's not the reality. That's not you, right? The bourbon-sipping, right. That's not the reality. 75% of faculty in universities are gig workers, glorified gig workers. But even below that, it's not even faculty that are the biggest employees on campuses. The biggest employees are the range of what I call ivory tower low-wage workers that do medical assistant work, janitorial services, cooks, clerical, maintenance, and security staff, mostly women, mostly of color. They face summertime downsizing to the point where they can still be eligible for public assistance because their wages are that low, full time. And when they successfully work for unionization, we find universities moving towards subcontracting so they can bypass union agreements. So you might say, oh, this is like I'm picking on universities, I'm being mean to the university, woo, 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 right? But these are the biggest employers in our cities. Washington University is not, if not the biggest, one of the biggest employers in the city of St. Louis. So we're talking about labor conditions, not being mean to the university. Finally, policing, which can be seen as a governance question. What good? Most schools have campus police, 75%. Nearly all carry guns, and about 9 in 10 have arrest and patrol jurisdictions off of campus. The idea is that these become extra agents of student or even community safety to help out city police. It's a public service. But let's look at what the crimes on campus for a minute. What are the major crimes on campus? Sexual violence, substance abuse. So if you're going to look at the benefit of campus police, you would hope they would do a good job with that first, right? Before we farm them out to the city. They do a horrible job of that. In some campuses, you have criminal amnesty. Some would say, as there was a big report going around on Twitter, that we need 500,000 more police. But the actual reality is that it's not capacity, it's approach, it's orientation. Let's look at what happens. Let's look at what we're talking about here. So, if universities were to actually police their campuses fully, they don't. While they over-police the surrounding communities. What's the common connection here? The university brand. No way do you want to advertise to potential families and investors that you have a campus full of white criminals. Yeah, I said it, right? And on the outside, you want to make sure they know that the surrounding cities and neighborhoods are safe for investment, whether that be in terms of your student dollars or in terms of pharmaceutical companies and software industries. So the policing apparatus that currently exists, under-policing the campus and over-policing the surrounding areas, is not by accident, it's by design. And then if you're a private university like Washington University, your private status, meaning that you are not subject to Freedom of Information Act laws, gets passed on to the campus police force. So not only do you have public power, you're a private police force with public power and no public oversight. Baltimore Senator Mary Helen Washington called this in her town when Johns Hopkins was trying to build out a private police force, which is still being battled over right now as we speak. This is akin to building a Vatican City in the middle of Baltimore. Because the private police force with no public oversight, but public power, arrest powers. You're creating your own private republic in the middle of black and brown communities, which then becomes the police force that governs and protects all the wealth that's being hoarded on campuses through tax exemption, through low-wage labor, through building out these knowledge communities. The campus police are a key piece in maintaining that wealth and facilitating the extraction of wealth from the city to the campus and keeping investments high and fears low and money flowing and workers working. Adjuncts, gig workers, graduate workers, students, undergraduates in the cafeterias, tech workers. This is the new economy. And the university is at the center, at the fulcrum of facilitating this dynamic. Y'all still with me? Okay. Because I want you to be clear that many schools, not just WashU, I'm not just picking on y'all. I wrote a whole book about a bunch of other places. So don't get in your feelings, right? Many schools and their host communities are at a crossroads. But I am here to tell you, as was pointed out by Stephanie, that there are other pathways. There are other ways of doing this. Another university is possible. One quick example, the University of Winnipeg. They designed a different approach to the university, not out of their own goodwill, not because they're just good people. Let's be clear, it was for a certain level of interest, that their demographic was changing in the 2000s. That would have primarily been, like most universities, a primarily white, middle-class, commuter class that came into the city, went to classes, and left before nightfall. Those demographics, as we know in the US, those families stopped having babies. And the campus was in the middle of a primarily indigenous and what they call new Canadian, what we call immigrant communities, largely non-white. And those were the people that were going to school, largely adult with children and low income. So they understood that we got to have a different model. If we want to retain our growing student body, we need to do a model about how the university works. So again, it wasn't just philanthropic or largesse. They were trying to keep hold to their market. But in doing so in a real way, they built out this vision of sustainability that was not just LEED certified buildings. It was also social, economic, and cultural, particularly with the indigenous community that surrounded the campus in mind. So what did that mean? That meant they built, this is the downtown Commons housing complex. 12 of the units that have the balconies are premium rate. They help underwrite all the other 3 layers of housing, from market to affordable to rent geared to income. The other three levels of housing are interchangeable. You don't know what kind of housing you're moving into. And the only difference in the premium rate is they have balconies. The ventilation system of this building in the common areas has been retrofitted for indigenous smudging practices. And the common areas also have free Wi-Fi if you can't afford it in your own individual units. They knew, and these units are not just available to students, they're available to city residents at those 4 different levels of value, of cost. They knew that in order to survive, they had to read the tea leaves. Who is their demographic? What is happening in the city? We cannot turn our backs and just try to be the ivory tower up on the hill and just hope we can hold the dear life to all the money and all the grants and the shrinking demographic of white families having kids that can full pay. We got to pivot to the new higher education landscape. They did that. Is it perfect? No. Hell no, it's not perfect. In fact, one faculty member was so disgusted that he said indigenous folks are going to come from the North End to come downtown to go to campus. So he built his own campus in the North End, largely indigenous, to build out a mini campus out of disgust with this. And this is better than what we mostly have here in the US. So I'm not trying to sell you some kind of utopia. This is a constant process. But the point here is that other pathways are possible. They had a contract for their food services with, who do you have? Aramark, Tedesco? Who do you have? Anybody know? What's the food service here? Bon Appetit. Okay, right. So one of these horrible food service companies that charge you $20 for a chicken sandwich, right? And the employees are mistreated. That's right. Right. They're subcontracted. Yep. Same my school. So they saw that going on, but the biggest thing, they saw crappy food and crappy conditions. They fired Aramark, because who they had, and they created their own company called Diversity Foods. On the employee side, 70% of the workers there are from what they call difficult to employ residents. First Nation, New Canadian, single mother, recently incarcerated, refugee, at the time Syrian refugees, who they reserved homes for in these building, units for in that building. And then they're moving from just simply wages to profit sharing. On the food supply side, 65% of their materials come from small farms within a 100-kilometer radius. I walked into the kitchen. Every workstation has a compost bin, and they send their cooking oil out to be converted into biodiesel. So this is not a utopia, this is not science fiction, this is not fold your arms off and just critique. This is happening. And it's still not even perfect. But it's these phenomena, these frameworks, these conversations, because for me, it's not about just being critical of university, it's about wherever your workplace is. I grew up in the Midwest, factory kid, right? All my family worked in factories. GM, Ford, Hormel. They are members of UAW. They believe that if you have a certain work condition and you are invested in your workplace, love compels you to make it what? Make it better. So the first question I get is, how could you be so critical of the hand that biting the hand that feeds you? This is my workplace, but also there's a social mission here that claims made about the mission. So why would I want to make it better? Based on the claims that the university makes and based on the capacity that the university has. So with that in mind, I built out what I call my Smart Cities Lab with the idea of the university as commons. With the lab, we research and consult on best practices for building equitable urban communities with a particular focus on university-driven development. This is a key, I said this earlier, this is a cheeky and direct hit on how smart cities is done when it usually focuses on infrastructure and there are no people. So our tagline is, the smartest cities develop without displacement. Boom. Right? Take that. And so through this lab, in just a matter of 15 months since the book has come out and the lab has been online, people are reading the book, they're seeing the work, they're seeing their stories. I don't mean academics, I mean community members. Some recently coming out of prison, some single mothers, some with 8th grade education. This is the power of humanities work that reaches beyond the academy. They're reading this work and they're seeing themselves in it, and they're asking me to come and help them. So in the last 15 months, I've been working with communities across the country, from New Haven to Chicago, from Berkeley to Miami, to build out what could be called an abolitionist work, organized around reparations, which at its root means repair. I know it's a scary word, but it means repair. And so the campus and its insatiable expansion is our primary site of struggle, both historic and contemporary. We, as in collaboration, the lab and the group, were victorious in New Haven. You might have heard about it. Helping to organize campus labor and community groups, pushing Yale to provide additional millions to the city for its increased portfolio of tax-exempt properties that suck life from the municipal budget. We pushed Yale to contribute an additional $10 million a year for their tax exemptions to the city of New Haven. Very proud of that. as a part of what humanities work, telling stories, doing cultural analysis, artwork on streets can do to push the needle for you folks that have doubts about the power of your work. It's there. It's there. I'm organizing with residents in the Black Bottom neighborhood of Philadelphia who are still suffering from the university-led demolition projects from the 1960s. Today, there are protests around the UC townhomes in West Philadelphia being displaced because we did the humanities work of doing historical work, archival work, to find out that the university actually promised in the 60s to create scattered site affordable housing throughout what's today called University City, and they failed to do so. So the push today is not, help us please, do better university. No, the call today is live up to your historical promises and agreements that made the prosperity you currently benefit from viable for everyone. That's the call. That's what history does. That's the piece they don't want to talk about. That's why humanities is powerful and important. So these are the kinds of things that the lab is doing. And from these, I could go on and on. We can talk about in the Q&A if you would like. But the research from the lab has assessed the town gown landscape across the country, and it brings us to a series of logical conclusions. Collectively, the lab and its partners, and hopefully maybe some of you, maybe, I don't know, call for reparations from higher education's explicit role in slavery, indigenous land seizures, Jim Crow segregation, and urban renewal practices. But we also call for payments in lieu of taxes. We call on schools to reserve a portion of their tax-exempt endowments for community projects and a transfer of investment to community-serving financial institutions away from the money market. We call for university medical centers to honor their mandate of indigent care that provides their tax exemption. We call on schools to attach a community benefits agreement to any campus expansion project that can include affordable housing, zip code-specific jobs, job training, scholarships, and access to campus facilities. Turn these campus spaces into commons because these communities pay for it. We insist on the build out of community-based zoning and planning boards with enforcement powers, not advisory boards. If you're going to move into our communities, we as communities need to have a say over the planning and zoning of those projects. And we insist that all campus developments be governed by a community charter in terms of use and access and benefit and distribution of wealth. We watch these schools throw away food daily, and I said this about 12 months ago to a group of medical students at the University of Pennsylvania. We see the schools throw away food daily and demand that they package their food into healthy meals for communities of need. One medical student by the name of Penner Cooper heard this within months. He worked with socialist groups in the city of Philadelphia and black and brown volunteers from the cafeteria to begin taking the food that gets thrown away every day and packaging it into healthy meals to be distributed to the communities of West Philadelphia. Low-hanging fruit. And to this day, the university will not recognize it or even provide funding to support it. It's still voluntary driven. That's a shame. So finally, we call, and this might hurt your hearts, but we call to invest, to divest in campus police. And then to invest, this is the part we don't want to hear, to invest in teams of preventative outreach and trauma care alongside investments in housing and food security programs that actually reduce harms for everyone. If there ever is a conversation about police abolition or divest invest, what better place to talk about that than at a university where you can respond to the reduction of armed policing with food security, with housing security, with trauma care. If anybody could do invest, divest, it's a university. We always talk about being models for the world. Model this. Live out your mission in how you sit in your communities, and not just in how you access grants in the marketplace. So, finally, it's my position that the university is this all-encompassing. If it is this all-encompassing, healthcare, policing, labor, governance, house it. Then an abolitionist vision must free the campus from its current conditions. Free the classrooms, free the cafeterias, free the laboratories and the residence halls from the profit university and put them in service to a people's university. We must free ourselves from the myth of the schoolhouse. Campuses have become sites of much broader struggles over neighborhood displacement, living wages, IP rights, universal health care, wealth redistribution, police abolition. And if we are just standing by, faculty, staff, and watching while this is all done in our name. But it's these same halls, these same cafeterias, these same laboratories. It's in these spaces that we have the building blocks to set the foundation for a different path. Listen, one of the primary claims of higher education is to serve the public and solve the world's problems. If we follow that claim to its logical conclusion, why wouldn't we start by addressing the university's hands in creating problems in our own backyards? Thank you.
I feel like you're all clapping for me. So thank you, Davarian. You've given us so much to think about. So before we adjourn to our reception provided to us by subcontracted Bon Appetit workers, we have some time for questions, and if people who have questions would like to come to the mic, we have a mic stand, which would be helpful so everyone can hear you. And Laura is going.
I'm just turning on the mic.
No, I was going to say Laura is now facilitating the mic for us. So yes, please, if you want to raise your hand, we can pass the mic down, or you can come up to the front, whatever you would like. So we invite you to engage. Yes.
Now it's on. Okay, great.
Hello.
I want to start by apologizing for asking you, but what about the parts that are missing from the work? Because
Sure.
the work is powerful, strong, and I'm very grateful for not only the quality of it, but your clarity and courage. So,
Thank you.
on the reparations side,
Yes.
where are the students who have, over time, at these very universities, believed in the promise or the dream, invested
Yeah.
time, labor, intellect,
Yeah. Yeah.
their credit rating, their financial security,
Yeah. Yep.
and lost, and are still waiting for repair.
That's right. So
Nationally here, in neighborhoods around the university,
Right.
and from cities that have sent their children to universities where they suffer that fate.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. So let me, just to be clear, I'm on the National Council of AUP, American Association of Professors. I'm a member of the Debt Collective. So I'm gonna let you be clear. I believe in debt abolition, especially student debt that's been unfairly targeted at ridiculous rates, based on a captive market with the promise that higher education is going to be a pathway to being able to pay back those loans when that's not been the case. And these lenders knew that from the very beginning. That's right. It's criminal. We need to get President Biden to push forward a robust debt, not even relief or forgiveness, debt ending, debt abolition plan. I believe that. And for those who say, well, I paid my debt off, why can't they? I paid my debt off too. I paid my debt off. I don't think I should have, but I did. But I definitely want those who come behind me to have a better life, to not go through what I went through. So that's my position.
so much.
Thank
that
you.
was a fantastic. It's been lovely having you here.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
I went to grad school at Yale, so I know how hard that 10 million would have been.
Yeah.
And you and Stephanie went to grad school at NYU, and
Yep.
so you know very intimately the kind of institution that is, a very
power.
similar institution to Yale. And perhaps I shouldn't say this in this room, WashU is one of those kinds of institutions.
We know it.
And I wonder in your work and activism how you have felt to be most powerful and effective engaging with specifically institutions that are really just closed off completely, and leadership teams and administrations that just would like this to continue.
Yes.
Because, as you say, there's an advantage to certain people and populations and communities.
Yeah, that's a great question.
So where have you found success, traction, collaboration?
Right.
I'm eager and hopeful that is possible, even at places like these places.
Thank you for that question. For decades, and New Haven Rising, for example, is a 40-year-old organization that's been doing, like, I came late to the party, but they brought me in during the pandemic to help consult with this work. And the powerful thing that they said that happened during the pandemic and through these conversations around the work is the encouragement to stop appealing to Yale and stop having the conversations on their terms. But the power of New Haven Rising was when their people began to turn to each other in the sites where Yale was most powerful, in city government, in the housing market, in the labor market, in the healthcare market. When those aggrieved and victimized figures turned to each other and began to build out a new set of values, it began to say, you know what, we're gonna turn to each other, we're gonna appeal to our public officials, we're gonna appeal to the public record, we're gonna use your work to talk about this as theft, we're gonna talk about the ways in which the money that you don't pay on taxes is actually being pulled from our public schools, where we have to share 20-year-old books, and we're gonna appeal to the public consciousness beyond the university. They can't control the narrative. That's what brought Yale to the table. Because people started saying, okay, wait a minute, what are we doing now? We're paying who to what? And the same thing could happen in St. Louis. But right now, the problem, not always, but the problem is that the very same public officials that you're appealing to are alumni of the institution. So they see their interests being converged with the university. So you begin to appeal and connect with those who are all around it, the threats of work stoppages. We begin to understand how dependent New Haven is on residents, and you'll know this from Dixville, from New Hallville. This is code as black and brown folks, just for you that don't know. That their wealth and their stability is predicated on that labor force. So if there are any threats of work stoppage or turning away from the values of the institution, that they will be decimated. They have for years told us and told the communities that they needed the university. The old joke was that what is New Haven without Yale? Bridgeport, which is a really racist, fucked up statement, saying basically you would be a ghetto. You would be a black and brown ghetto if it wasn't for Yale. And we turned it around and said, no, actually, Yale wouldn't be anything without this residence. And just that approach activated a very different understanding of mobilization around what was at stake and how the money flowed. That those buildings of glass and steel weren't possible without the tax abatements. That $40 billion endowment in the money market wasn't possible without the exemption. Those turkey giveaways, those tutoring programs, those other forms of piecemeal civic engagement are actually being paid for by the city. These aren't gifts from the university. If we do a forensic accounting of the money paid in as compared to the money going out, it don't add up. So as we start visualizing these dynamics, Yale came to the table. I should have included it. There's an amazing, we brought in artists, talk about humanity. We brought in artists. And at the time, this is in 2021, the Yale pays actually the biggest pilot in the country at $13 million. So they pay and they always talk about that. So what we did was, but they had at the time a $30 billion endowment. And so artists got together on the street right by the cemetery, and they put a red stripe to signal, it was like 3 inches, to kind of represent the 13 million. And then they had a blue stripe that went down the length of the block to account for the endowment. That was powerful. For all the op-eds I wrote, for the book that I wrote, that was cute, but it was that visualization that turned the tide for a lot of people. They realized that they were $157 million short in taxes if their land was properly assessed. That was powerful. It got state politicians involved. Now I'm now working with state legislators in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, where I live, to try to push nonprofits to pay, if not fully, at least 25% of their taxes. Momentum is growing, especially as the economic recessions get stronger. And the endowments of these major institutions is growing. So these are the ways, this connective tissue is what was powerful for people to see. These conversations have been happening in isolation, the labor conversation, the housing, but to bring them together and see how they're interconnected, that gave people hope and power and courage in a way that they hadn't had before, or pushed them along further. And that was the powerful hook, if you will. Mm-hmm.
We have time for a couple more questions, or people
Or we can eat.
are also invited to ask a question. I know we haven't forgotten about you. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Baldwin.
Good evening.
Appreciate your talk.
Thank you.
And I especially appreciate your candor. I am a PhD student at St. Louis University, one of those universities.
Yes.
In American Studies.
Father, yes.
Yeah,
Tearing up the whole city.
Yes, but I'm also a professor at Harris State University,
Oh,
which
yeah.
is HBCU here. So my question to you is, how do we involve HBCUs in this? Because they are even further at the bottom of the food chain
That's
when
right.
it comes to economics.
Yes. So just as a quick anecdote, in the state of Maryland, about 2 years ago, HBCUs in Maryland won a $70 million lawsuit because of the ways in which the state had been underfunding them in relationship to the state university, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, the major. So there's a huge disparity here. So but there are some better endowed HBCUs like Howard that are doing some of the same land grabs. Not so much the university, but the medical school.
Right.
In, off Georgia Ave. But then a lot of the things I'm calling for with what's happening in Winnipeg, at the University of Winnipeg, is actually being done by community colleges and smaller HBCUs with less support. They have food banks. They have tutoring programs. They have housing programs. They're trying to make their real estate or their land available. They're the ones doing it with less, and we need to showcase and highlight what they're doing to shame these institutions to do better with more resources. It's another example of that this is possible. It's happening. Right? In my book, I talk about Malcolm X Community College in Chicago in the 60s and 70s, building out a prison annex for incarcerated residents on the west side of Chicago. Right? Teaching black studies classes in the 60s and 70s early. Right. Firing off-duty Chicago PD and hiring a black-owned, unarmed private security team to police or secure their campus. We have historical and contemporary examples of how HBCUs and community colleges are doing the right thing and doing it better. They're the models. That's what I would say, if that helps.
But yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody for being here.
Yes.
Thank you to Davarian for giving us so much to think about and talk about. And yes, let's enjoy the reception. Thanks, everybody.